name is Sarah Howard, and I'm the Youth and Community Services Manager for the Danube Regional Library. And we're happy to have Paige Witek here with us. She's the Education Coordinator with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, located in Arrow Rock, Missouri. And we're going to hear all about woodpeckers today and their excavating of their cavities and how to identify ones that we see in Missouri. So please feel free to put questions in the chat, and Paige will be our fearless leader. And I will magically disappear so she can share her screen with all of us and take us on a journey of woodpeckers. So welcome, Paige, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to talk to you today about woodpeckers. Let me just share my screen with everybody and get this going. Okay, so woodpeckers are obviously what we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I want to tell you all, sorry, a little bit more about myself, so that you know who this stranger is talking to you. This is a picture of me at one of my in-person programs. So normally I'm quite animated. But I'm going to try to keep my hands to myself. Because sometimes that messes up the internet. A little bit about me. So I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this is quite a big leap from where I grew up to where I went to college. But I did spend a good portion of my life there. So I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. So if you're familiar with those, give me a shout out, let me know. And I've worked at various wildlife organizations and sanctuaries since then, working with wildlife rehab and doing various education jobs. And I moved to Missouri in 2017. And I started out as a seasonal educator with the Missouri River Bird Observatory during that time. And I've been with them ever since. And now I'm the education coordinator. So I have more of a full-time position, being able to teach people about birds, which is what I love doing, because I think birds are awesome. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you learn a little bit more about why I think that, particularly in reference to the woodpeckers, which are a really cool group of birds. A little bit very briefly about the organization. If you aren't familiar with us, this easiest way I can summarize what we do is to say that we work towards conserving birds and their habitats, and we do that through research and monitoring, education and outreach, and advocacy. And if you want to learn more about the organization, Sarah's going to put the website in the chat, but it's just mrbo.org, and you can learn all about the work that we do. Woodpeckers. Okay. So first, I just want to go over some general life history traits of woodpeckers. So kind of things to keep in mind as we go through this presentation today. So most woodpeckers nest in the forest, but they can live in other habitats as well. They excavate cavities in dead trees for nesting. They mostly eat a variety of insects, and they drum for communication, which I'm going to explain a little bit more later. And I will note that these are generalizations and don't necessarily apply to all woodpecker species, but they do apply to a majority of the woodpecker species, particularly the ones that we have here in Missouri. But there are woodpeckers who excavate nest cavities in cactus and different other plants like that too. But these are kind of the main life history traits I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about woodpeckers. So woodpeckers today. So what we're going to do next is we're going to become woodpeckers ourselves and feel a little silly. Now, keep in mind that I can't see you and nobody else can see you, but I think it's really fun to kind of pretend that we're woodpeckers for a little bit so we can understand some of the cool adaptations that they have. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold one hand up to your nose like your beak, and with the other hand you're going to pretend it's a piece of wood, and I want you to peck at your hand for about 30 seconds. So not for a very long time, and to act like a woodpecker. So just for 30 seconds, kind of go like this. And we're just going to experience what it might be like to be a woodpecker. So we're going to do that for 30 seconds. Ready, set, go. All right, that was about 30 seconds. And I hope you all did it. I hope I wasn't just me being silly on the screen. But I'd love to hear, like, how was your woodpecker experience? Does anything hurt? Maybe the back of your hand, maybe your nose, and other things. If you want to put that in the chat, only Sarah and I will be able to see what you put in the chat. So just let me know, like, how was your experience? Does my bridge of my nose tends to hurt a little bit after doing that? My neck gets a little bit sore, different things like that. So just let me know what your woodpecker experience was like, because what we're going to talk about next is a woodpecker has a variety of adaptations that allow it to do what no other bird really can do. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about a woodpecker's equipment. Oh, I see some things in the chat I want to see. Yeah, nose hurts a little. Some people are fine. Yeah, hard to peck very fast for sure. So yeah, so how does a woodpecker able to do that and bang their head against wood over and over again to create those cavities? Well, one very important piece of equipment is their beak shape. So woodpeckers are often characterized as chisel-billed because they peck into living or dead wood to find grubs or build a nest. And so they have this kind of chisel-shaped beak that allows them to kind of chisel away at that wood. And what's really interesting to me is that the cells in the tips of their beaks are constantly replaced, and that prevents them from wearing down over time. So that's kind of a cool thing about woodpeckers. All right, next they have these bristly feathers over their nostrils, and that prevents the inhalation of wood particles as they chisel. So you can see in this picture, so this is where those like bristly feathers are covering their nostrils. Because just like, you know, a carpenter that you may know, they may wear goggles or a mask or something to prevent from inhaling those wood particles. The woodpeckers have that too. They have these feathers to help protect them from inhaling that. And I'm going to show you a video of a woodpecker chiseling out a cavity later, and you'll see that these feathers don't look white like this. They look a little bit brown. And the feathers didn't change color. That's from just chiseling out the wood. So they have that to help protect their nostrils. They also have this long harpoon-like tongue, and this may not necessarily aid in the excavating of the cavity, but it definitely aids them in being able to slurp out insects from underneath bark. And these tongues can be up to 4 inches long depending on the species. And when you're thinking about the size of a woodpecker's head, 4 inches long is quite long. And as you can see from these pictures too, the tongue kind of wraps around the outside of the skull and kind of goes all the way up to their nose. So it really is quite long inside. And the tip of it is kind of sticky and has kind of a little bit of a harpoon-like shape that helps them kind of catch those insects. Now, as you're holding onto a tree, it may be hard to be a little bit stable as you're banging your head against the tree. So these woodpeckers have really strong and stiff tail feathers that they use as a prop while climbing in order to balance themselves. So this kind of works like a tripod. So they've got both feet and their tail to help stabilize them against that wood. They also have what's called zygodactyl feet. And they're specifically adapted to cling and clasp onto these trees. And what zygodactyl means is that they have 2 toes that face forward and 2 toes that face backward. Most songbirds have what we call angiodactyl feet, and they have 3 forward-facing toes and 1 backward-facing toe. So that allows them to like perch more and grasp like that. But the woodpeckers have those zygodactyl feet, which is like a very dinosaur type term, I think, that allows them to kind of grab onto the trees like they do when they have that tripod shape. Also, so I think this is one of the coolest adaptations because Woodpeckers may peck a total of 8,000 to 12,000 pecks per day, and they do so at 20 pecks per second. So one person mentioned it's kind of hard to peck that fast. So the woodpecker hammers at wood with such force that its brain has to be protected from damage by a special skull. So the woodpecker's skull is made of a spongy type bone, and as the bird hammers rapidly and powerfully at a tree trunk with its beak, that spongy bone acts like a cushion and protects the brain from the force of the impact. So like I talked about how when I pretend to be a woodpecker, it gets kind of sore right here. And if I were a woodpecker, that bone, that part of my skull behind my beak, would be kind of spongy to help absorb that impact. The skull is also surrounded, right, by that bird's long tongue, which gives that a little bit extra padding. There are also really thick muscles in the neck that help to absorb the shock, as well as be able for the woodpecker to move as quickly as it does. And the woodpecker's brain also fits very tightly inside the skull, and this stops the brain from being shaken and damaged when the bird drills into the wood or into a tree. So they have all of these different equipment and tools to be able to do what no other birds can do. So even though other birds may use the cavities that woodpeckers create, those other birds may not necessarily be able to create those cavities themselves because they don't have all of this equipment that the woodpecker does. And so here's a video that I took in my own backyard of a downy woodpecker excavating a tree cavity that I would love to share with you just to kind of show you what it looks like. And you can see even from just the still of the video that the feathers around this downy woodpecker's nostrils are a little bit brown instead of white like I showed you in that other picture. So here we go. Here's the video. Hopefully everybody can see it. So you can see she's kind of cautious, kind of watching. Maybe she can sense that I'm watching her in this video. Yeah, so you can see that tree also has some other cavities in there as well. And someone asked in the chat what kind of tree this woodpecker was in. And I believe it, I want to say it's a redbud tree. I know there's a redbud tree around that tree. I'm looking at it. I can see it right now from out the window. And I think that's what it is, or it's near one. But woodpeckers, when they're excavating cavities, they're usually using dead or dying wood because it's a lot softer than the live trees. So this is kind of a dead part of a tree that they're using. And yeah, she is spitting out wood that she's pecked out. So you can kind of see that in the video that they're kind of, because you know, the extra shavings, they don't necessarily want it in the cavity. So they're kind of pecking at it and then kind of spitting it out. So I think it's kind of cool to just see how a woodpecker kind of goes about doing that. Granted, this cavity is maybe a little bit farther along than some other ones, but I think that's kind of cool. So woodpeckers have all of this equipment, pretty fancy equipment to be able to create those cavities in the wood. And these tools or adaptations also allow the woodpecker to access the insects hidden in the wood and underneath the bark. But those aren't the only reasons woodpeckers peck wood per se. sometimes they make a sound when they do it. And this is called drumming. And this is a unique form of communication that's pretty unique to woodpeckers, where they rapidly peck on an object to create a pattern of sound. And woodpeckers do this. It kind of takes the same reasons that other birds sing. It kind of takes the place of what other birds do when they're trying to sing a song. So woodpeckers do this to attract a mate or announce their territory. So they'll peck at wood, they'll kind of drum to attract the mate, and then the partner will kind of drum back, and they'll kind of have this like drumming duet. And this is also one reason woodpeckers might peck at your gutters. So some people are like, what are they doing? Don't they know that that's wood? Yes, they do know that that's not wood. And what they do know is that those gutters are going to make a much louder sound. And that's going to allow them to create kind of, or defend maybe possibly a much bigger territory, because they can be a lot louder with their sound. And what I think is also really fascinating is that each species of woodpecker drums a little bit differently. And that brings me to go over the 7 species of woodpeckers we have here in Missouri. And I don't know how to identify a woodpecker by its drum, but I do, but you can learn pretty easily by by their plumage, by the way they look, and also by their sounds, their other sounds that they make. So that's what we're going to go over next. We're going to talk about the different woodpecker species in Missouri. Oh, I forgot. Let's play a recording of the drumming sound so you know what I'm talking about. Great. Yeah. So I hope everybody could hear that. So now let's talk about some woodpecker species we have here in Missouri and how to identify them. Okay, hold on. Okay, looks like people can hear it. Okay, so first up, I have this woodpecker. It may look somewhat familiar. They're very common. This is the red-bellied woodpecker. Most often I hear them, I see them. They're very common in backyards, at feeders. They kind of have this red. Why they're called a red belly, you may be wondering. I do too. They have kind of, or you can kind of see in this picture, a little bit of a reddish wash, but overall they kind of have a white looking belly, kind of this black and white checkered wings and tail. And then they have kind of a white face and this red on the back of their neck. So you may notice there's a difference between these two pictures. So this is the female red-bellied woodpecker. Her red on her head only goes kind of to the back, almost same with her eye. And the red on the male woodpecker's head goes all the way to their beak. So in general, you'll notice that you can often tell the difference between male and female by the male has more red somewhere, with woodpeckers at least. And this is what the red-bellied woodpecker sounds like. So this is what you will listen for in your backyard. So it's kind of describing, you heard that little bit of drumming at the end there. It's kind of like chuck, 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 chuck. And then they have this like, it kind of sounds like they're laughing at you. So that's the red-bellied woodpecker. Next, we have, you might be able to guess the name of this woodpecker. So this is why that other one isn't called the red-headed woodpecker, because this is the red-headed woodpecker. So you can see they have that bright red crimson head, and then they have a white belly and kind of that bold black and white patterning on their wings and back. And these birds are a little bit less common. I tend to find them in more like open woodland areas. So kind of thinking about like kind of more spread apart trees with a little less understory, are a type of habitat that the red-headed woodpeckers like. And this is what to listen for them. So they sound a little bit more screechy, kind of more mad almost than some other birds. But yeah, that's the red-headed woodpecker. So hopefully you can see one of those soon. This is the biggest species of woodpecker we have in Missouri. This is called the pileated woodpecker, or some people say the pileated woodpecker. Both are correct. It's all up to you what you want to say. I learned from the person that taught me. They said pileated, so that's what I typically say. Like I said, they're the biggest species of woodpecker we have in Missouri. I think they're the most dinosaur-looking woodpecker we have. And again, we can tell the difference between male and female. With the red-headed woodpecker, we cannot tell just by looking at the bird, but with the pileated, we can. So I don't have the female, I don't have a picture of a female pileated woodpecker, unfortunately. But you can see in this picture that this woodpecker has kind of a red, what we call malar stripe, kind of extending out from its beak. That is an indicator of the male pileated woodpecker. So the female would have a black stripe there. And you can see this photo is titled Father and Sons by Marvin DeJong. And so you can see these are male woodpeckers in the nest, as well as the father tending to the nest. So that's the pileated woodpecker. And I will say that I more often hear them than I see them because they're a little bit more shy of a bird. So this is what to listen for if you're looking to hear them. And in the recording, it kind of sounds like it's like echoing. And that is kind of how like I would describe it too. Like you can hear it pretty far away from where the bird actually is. And they tend to hang out in kind of forests near water. So you could kind of say swampy, but just kind of forest near like a bigger body of water is where I see them most often, or really hear them most often. But they can be really cool to see because they're quite big woodpeckers. They'll surprise you. So that's the biggest one we have in here in Missouri. And this is the smallest woodpecker we have here in Missouri. So this is called the downy woodpecker. And again, we can tell male versus female. The male has this little red spot on the back of its head, and the female there, I believe it is white. Again, I only have males in this picture. I don't have a picture of a female downy woodpecker, but in the video you saw earlier, that was a female downy woodpecker. And they're very similar to the next species that I'm going to share with you, the hairy woodpecker. But a big way to tell the difference between the two is based on their sound. So I'm going to play the recording again. And I want you to listen for kind of a down trill. So they have some squeaks, and then they have a trill, which is kind of a series of notes where you can't really decipher between the notes. And it kind of descends a little bit at the end. So I want you to listen for that. Yeah, so you kind of heard those little squeaks and then that. So that's a good thing to listen for the downy woodpecker. And these are very common. You can find them in your backyard, in your nearby park. You find them pretty much everywhere. So they're very similar to the hairy woodpecker. So this is the female hairy woodpecker, and this one over here is the male. So you can see in this photo, this is the downy woodpecker over here, and this is the hairy woodpecker over here. So you can see some differences. The hairy woodpecker is slightly bigger in size, but that can be very difficult to tell unless you're looking right like at a picture like this where you see them side by side. So there are some other things that we can look for. The last thing I'll point out in this photo is that downy woodpeckers do have these spots, or can have these spots on the outer edges of the tail feathers. Not all do. So an absence of spots doesn't necessarily mean it's a hairy woodpecker, But if it does have spots, that's going to be a downy woodpecker. So with the hairy woodpecker, like I said, the sounds are a great way. So when this hairy woodpecker trills, I think it's a little bit more of a sharp squeak. And then it doesn't have that descending trill. It kind of stays level in its sound. So this is what they sound like. And if those sounded very similar to you, that's okay. It does take some practice to be able to learn the difference. There's still really expert birders that still struggle with the difference between these two species. Another way to tell by their appearance is by looking at their beak length. So you may have noticed in that other picture too, that the hairy has a much longer beak. So if you were to fold back on the downy woodpecker's beak onto its head, the beak wouldn't reach the back of its head. However, if you were to fold back the hairy woodpecker's beak onto its head, it's almost as equal length. It probably would reach the back of its head. So the hairy woodpecker has a much longer beak. And I will say that when you see it, like sometimes you look at a bird and you're like, hairy downy, hairy downy. Usually those are downies I end up coming to. When I see a hairy woodpecker, I go, oh, that beak is much longer. That's a hairy woodpecker. But like I said, it takes a lot of practice, so don't feel too overwhelmed if you're still struggling with the difference between these two. But it can be fun to practice. Hairy woodpeckers are a little bit more shy, so it's really fun when you get to see them. This bird, this woodpecker is a unique looking woodpecker and is kind of a unique behaving woodpecker. This is the northern flicker, and they'll kind of behave in ways that are a little bit different because you'll sometimes see them on the ground because they'll eat ants and other ground insects and different things like that. And they, again, the difference between male and female doesn't have to do with red this time. The male has what we call a mustache mark. So it's got this black mark kind of coming off from its beak, kind of like a mustache. And then this is the picture of the female, and they don't have that. And you might notice the colors look a little bit different. This picture highlights some of the yellow that the northern flicker has. So we call this yellow shafted flicker because it's got this yellow underneath its tail feathers. And if you went out west, this would be red. They have red shafted northern flickers. So I think we're pretty lucky to have the yellow because underneath the wings and underneath the tail, it really looks quite pretty when they fly over you. And this is what they sound like. So they have a lot of unique sounds, and sometimes they can be a little bit tricky to hear them and be like, is that a woodpecker? It doesn't quite sound like the other woodpeckers, but they can be really fun to learn their sounds as well. The last woodpecker that we have here in Missouri that I'm going to share with you is one that we only have here in the wintertime, but it is here now. I have seen them around. This is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So this is a unique woodpecker. They're called sapsuckers because they have this behavior of drilling holes, small holes in the sides of trees to excavate that sap to be able to eat that sap. And they'll also use sap in trees to kind of line their nest to help protect their nest cavities, which I think is really cool. The stickiness kind of helps protect them from snakes and different things like that from getting into the nest. And again, this is a woodpecker. The male has more red. So this is the male over here with the red throat, and the female has that white throat. And they kind of look like hairy and downy, but they have this red cap on the top of their head. And they're overall, I say, more like grungy and like dirty looking, but I think it's still really cool. And this is what they sound like. So I don't hear them nearly as much. And I don't know if that's just because they're only here in the winter time, so I don't hear them all year long, or if they just don't vocalize as much in the winter, which is definitely possible. But they're really cool to see. So I hope you all get to see one of these yellow-bellied sapsuckers this winter. Just go look in the forest for this uniquely colored bird. But that's all I had. Those are all the woodpeckers in Missouri. I hope you learned something today. Thank you so much for listening. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, but before we go, if you enjoyed learning about birds today, and you're interested in learning more about birds, and you are somebody or know somebody that's between the ages of 8 to 17, you can join our Missouri Young Birders Club. And you can find out more at the website. That's just moyoungbirders.org. So again, thank you all for listening. And I don't know, do we have any time for questions, Sarah?
We sure do. If someone has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. You're getting a lot of thank yous. I will say that this, as you know, was recorded, and so it should be up on our website by the end of next week. So you can get to it from that if you want to review it and hear the sounds again. This was fascinating. I probably have heard more woodpeckers in my life than I realize.
Yes. Most of them are quite loud and let you know that they're around.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you all for coming, and you've got the email and information for the organization if you want to get into touch for more information. So, yay. Thanks so much. Have a good time, folks.